So we're starting off today with a session with Linda Jones. Linda from the library, our favourite librarian, is going to be talking to us today about a very important matter when writing and researching for your essays, and that is referencing. Morning, Linda.
Good morning.
Now, the first question that students often ask is, when in the process of researching and writing for your essay should you start to think about referencing? Is it right at the very end when you've finished your essay?
No.
When would be a better time?
Really and truly, it would be a better time to think about it before you even start. We do try to prepare people for referencing, so that we will send out this booklet,
Yes.
which gives you basic hints and tips and shows you how to reference almost any reliable source that you could come across. And most people see it, think, I'll think about that later. And I must admit, I think probably today's sessions are starting at the very lowest point, because referencing does seem to cause more people, more problems than it is really justifiable. And people get very angsty about it.
Yes, they do.
I think if you have had a long time out of education and have forgotten about referencing, that causes problems. But it can also be that you're starting for the very first time on serious academic research and you've never considered referencing before. And I can remember that when I was a student, in the very dim, distant past, I spent a long time creating my own little colour coding system for my referencing, simply because nobody had taught me how to do it.
Yes.
And it didn't seem quite so important in those days. But now I think we do really recognise that this is a basic academic skill. However, it's not one that you learn in its entirety by reading a booklet. It is very much one that you learn on the job, and it is something which you should consider thinking of as an improving skill throughout your entire academic career. And I still do answer referencing queries from lecturers, so it is throughout your whole academic career.
Absolutely.
So I think it's not aiming for perfection at your first attempt, but it is recognising the rules and thinking about how you apply them every time that you actually start writing. But as I said, it's before you start writing, because unless you collect the references as you are researching, you are totally lost. The most frequent question I am asked in the library by students here on campus is, do you remember that big red book you found me?
And you don't, Linda?
Well, sometimes I can. But there are a lot of big red books in the library. And I'm getting older, I think. I used to, in a very small library, be able to identify a book if they could show me a photocopy of one page of it. Nowadays, it is very, very much more difficult. And of course, e-books look different from print books. And with distance learners, they're more likely to have been using print books. One handy tip is, if you've used a print book, why not actually keep it on your bookshelf? It doesn't mean you're keeping it away from anybody else to read, but it means that when you are worrying about what was that book, you can go to your bookshelf and just test, that is the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So that guide that the library produce is a very handy one to keep on your desk, by your side.
I have one by my side all the time.
Excellent. Okay. Now, Linda, as always on our sofa, no expense spared, we have top 5 referencing errors that we thought we would go through to see where people are generally going wrong, and if you've got any advice on where they could avoid that. First of all, not understanding the purpose of a reference list.
Right, at this point I draw on evidence from my own family. I have had a great deal of experience in trying to teach my own son how to reference. I did actually manage very well with the whole of his football team apart from him, because he would never listen. But his basic approach to referencing from the day that he started college was, I'm going to impress the lecturer with how much I've read. And having a mother who was a librarian, he understood about library catalogues. So his biology essays would end with a complete list of every biology book that was in the library. You would only have to go and check his library records to see that he'd never borrowed one of them. And it was very, very difficult to tell which ones he had read, because quite often what he was doing was actually writing the essay from his lecture notes.
Right.
Lecturers do track references, particularly if they feel a little bit worried about a particular argument, or because they don't recognise the reference. So you are not there to impress with the amount you have read. You are there in the reference list trying to illustrate to your lecturer that you have read and understood something, which means that if it's in the reference list, it should be making a valid point within the essay, and it should be referenced within the essay well. When you start actually just conglomerating a reference list, you quite often forget to put any reference in the essay to it, and it immediately shows up. It just gives the impression that you're trying very hard, but you don't really know what you're doing.
I think often students think that we ask them to provide a reference list just to be awkward. Whereas in actual fact, we're all doing it as writers at whatever stage we are, because people need to know where we've got the information that we're talking about, so that we can verify that they're talking about the correct thing and they're talking about it correctly, but also so that the reader can go and follow up that reference themselves and find out more information.
And I think as well that a very narrow reference list, and with some first year students, what I see is a reference list that is entirely based on the textbook. You're just showing that you've read one thing, and not that you've explored it, investigated it, looked at other viewpoints. And remember, textbooks do have their own reference lists, which you can follow up on. And if you go from something like a textbook to a slightly more complex source, so because I do law and criminology, quite often textbooks refer you to cases. If you can reference a case as well, that's great. If you can reference an article that's been written since the reference book was published, you're likely to get a newer viewpoint. So there are lots of tricks that you can use to find not better sources, but different sources which might expand your understanding.
Absolutely. Because it's all about, when you're writing essays, it's all about, isn't it, the gathering of lots of different viewpoints, lots of different evidence, and then putting your argument together.
Yes, and making it seem seamless.
Yes, that's the aim. Right. So we now understand the purpose of a reference list. Number 2, referencing errors. Oh, who would do that, Linda? Not using referencing at Portsmouth.
Partly it's because people don't realise it's there.
Right, tell us what it is.
The purple R on the library website, underneath it lurks an enormous amount of information. It will not do your referencing for you. And I am a total advocate of not adopting automated referencing schemes until you actually understand how the referencing system that you are using works. Because otherwise you will produce something that looks vaguely okay and a lecturer can tear it to pieces because you actually haven't taken account of punctuation and things like that. So referencing at Portsmouth will give you a drop-down menu approach where you can say, I'm reading a book, I want to reference that book, the book's a printed book, the book's an electronic book, and you go through those sets of choices until you basically get down to exactly what it is you're reading. And at the bottom a link will appear which will take you to advice on exactly how to reference it.
And what I really like about referencing at Portsmouth, because I use it all of the time, as everybody should, is that it not only tells you how to reference it in the reference list, and it provides you with an example, which is really handy. It also tells you how to cite it within the essay as well, doesn't it?
Yes, and the in-text citation is again a bit of a worry, particularly with students who are coming back to academia or are actually starting for the first time and have never ever before felt the iron grip of the word count. So it does illustrate ways of incorporating your reference in using the minimum word count, as well as doing it in a rather formal, automatic way, which actually does tend to increase your word count. So incorporating the reference into sentences is definitely something that, perhaps not in your first essay, but certainly on your second, trying to do, because it helps reduce the word count a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So the big R on the library website is where everyone needs to go. You mentioned books, but it covers an enormous range of other things, doesn't it?
It will do absolutely everything, including things which really say that you don't need to be referencing them, like unofficial correspondence, telephone calls. But it will cover all those things, radio programmes, absolutely anything you want.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Number 3, not collecting all of the necessary information.
Right, now that's what I was saying about starting before you start to write. It is collecting that information. If you're using an ebook, it's exactly like a print book, and you can look behind the title page and it'll give you all the publication details. If you've borrowed a print book from the library and returned it and then decided that you are going to reference it, it becomes more difficult. But do remember that the library catalogue does actually show every book we own, complete with its publication details. So long as you've captured the page number, you should be able to retrace your steps. It's also important to look at journals and journal articles and look at the way that they are referenced, and take on board the fact that journals can have very similar titles sometimes. Criminology is actually one of the worst subject areas, because there are very few words that appear in criminology journal titles.
And you need to remember quite a lot of information, don't you? I always get caught out with journal articles because I forget to write down the page numbers. So I then have to go back afterwards, which is quite frustrating. But I think when students are writing notes before they write up their essay, it's a good idea at that stage to write all of the details down that you need, then write the notes, and then you've got it all in one place.
And for distance learners, I really do recommend that for journal articles, if you found it, save it. Don't go looking for it again. Actually start building yourself up folders of material, because what you use in your first year, quite surprising, will sometimes appear as something that's just an extra point in your final dissertation. So it's worth saving what you've got. And it's another way of getting value for money from your fees. You're going away with your own private library.
Exactly, lovely. Yeah, so organisation is key, isn't it?
Yes.
That one. Right, number 4, not recognising different types of sources.
Ah, yes. Then this is the email I always get with a web link saying, how do I reference this? And the very first thing you've got to do is identify what it is. Sometimes when you identify what it is, you might decide not to reference it. Websites, for instance. Websites appear in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Some are very authoritative. We have lots of government websites which will give you a great deal of guidance about policy, developments, may give you stats, all the rest of it. But there are an enormous number of websites that are created by minority interest groups with actually not very much knowledge, with a particular bias, and you're going to have to investigate them really thoroughly before you start using them as evidence. So online is a particular danger area for finding things.
I think sometimes students think, oh, I shouldn't be citing anything online, but that's not the case. There are some, you've just got to be a little bit more savvy, haven't you, about checking the reliability of the source before you use it.
If I had been a little cleverer before I arrived here, I should have sent you a link for a video to show during today's sessions. One of my colleagues went to visit the Houses of Parliament last week, and she came back with some really good resources about official documentation. I'm sure lots of students would like information from places that show no political bias. You wouldn't necessarily think of going to Parliament for that. But there is a House of Commons and a House of Lords library who employ enormous hordes of researchers, and they provide something called research briefings. And they are totally unbiased.
Yes, really useful.
And really great background for almost
Absolutely,
anything. There's a lovely little video which explains their motivations and why they do it, which appears on the subject page, but I will send the link.
That with our students. That would be brilliant.
But that is something which is immediately identifiable as a high quality source, and it's getting those high quality sources. If you investigate Parliament independently, what I tend to find is that I'm being asked to help someone reference evidence to a House of Commons committee. The evidence actually hasn't achieved anything apart from give one person's viewpoint or one body's viewpoint. So it's a little bit dodgier in terms of fact.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Linda. We'll finish with the final one, which is just very importantly, don't give up. We've got library support.
Contact the library.
We've got the live chat, haven't we, on the website? And of course, referencing reports, which is really handy as well. Thank you very much again, Linda. That was really, really helpful in terms of how to do better referencing.